Hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi Jacki Ninio, and I'm from Emanuel Synagogue in Sydney, and I'm going to be speaking with you today for about an hour about Judaism and funerals, death, and mourning. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or wherever you can ask questions, and I'm really happy to answer them as I go along. There will be, I don't do slides, so there will be notes available afterwards with all the information and everything I've spoken about today. So if you want to just listen and then refer to those notes later, you're welcome to do so. I'm also directing people to our synagogue website, which has a booklet about death and mourning, which contains more detailed explanations about lots of the aspects of this talk. So if you go to www.emanuel.org.au and you go to the section on funerals and mourning, and then you click on our booklet for funerals and mourning, and you'll find lots of information there as well. So I want to start with the concept of death in Judaism and what our tradition has to say about it. The Torah, our basic foundational document, does not say very much about death at all. It talks about us dying and being gathered to our ancestors. So the idea is that we are buried into the earth and somehow there's a gathering together of ancestors. It is very much the idea is that the body houses the soul, and the soul is the essence of who a human being is. And at death, the body releases the soul, or the soul is freed from its earthly body, and it continues on another journey. But as I say, the Torah does not spend any time really talking about what happens after you die. But Jews were living amongst other peoples and other communities, and they were spending a lot of time thinking about what happens after we die. And so Jews started asking the same question. And because there's not a specific mention in our foundational documents, many different concepts and ideas about what happens to the soul after we die have emerged. There are more mainstream ones, and I'm going to indicate which ones are the more mainstream as opposed to the others. So almost everyone agrees that the soul continues to live or to exist after a person dies. But what happens to that soul is up for discussion. So there is a notion in Judaism called Gilgul, which has the idea, it's like a wheel turning, so that souls turn and return, and they keep coming back to earth, so they're kind of recycled. In Judaism, there's no notion of like moving up in various realms or, perfecting yourself so you keep coming back. It's this idea that there's a finite number of souls, and they return and keep coming back to earth. There is also a suggestion that a soul can be split and put in more than one body, so that accounts for how populations can increase, even though there's a finite number of souls. Some suggest that each soul has a specific purpose to fulfill on earth, and so they keep returning until that purpose is complete, and then after that the soul makes its way to wherever souls continue on to, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Rabbi Kamens, one of the rabbis I work with, has a beautiful analogy about the soul and suggests that it's a bit like a wave in the ocean. So our life is the wave, and we come onto the shore as the wave, and that's the journey of our life. And then once we die, we return back into the ocean. So we don't remain a distinct wave anymore. So our soul is not a distinct soul, but our soul does return and then comes back as a new wave. But it's not necessarily that same, it wouldn't be that same soul and that same life, because that soul and that life, that wave has already existed. So what happens to these souls after we die? So there is a tradition that they return to a place called Gan Eden, which is the Garden of Eden. So an idea that the souls go to paradise, go to a place of pure peace and goodness. Many people have talked about what that experience is like, and really it depends who's writing about it, what they say that experience will be. So for some of the rabbis, returning is all about going to study Torah at the feet of God for all eternity. That's not my idea of paradise. I think my soul is more likely to be, eating fried food and watching bad reality TV in paradise. But the rabbis definitely reflected this notion that paradise was a place of pure goodness and peace, and the souls kind of spend their time there. There is no Jewish notion of hell. There's no understanding or concept of a place where you are tormented and tortured for the rest of your life based on your actions on earth. There is a principle of repentance, this idea that when you die, your soul needs to repent for the wrong that you have done on earth, but the maximum time a person could spend repenting is a year, is 12 months. And remember that, because that will come back a little bit later on in the discussion of mourning practices. But the worst human being that you could ever imagine, they spend a maximum of 12 months. So most people will have a little moment sort of seeking forgiveness for the wrongs that they have done, and then they'll make their way to the place where souls gather and exist, unless you are a proponent of this idea that souls keep coming back, like the ocean wave principle. What that process of atonement for the wrongdoings that we have done on earth looks like depends on your perspective and which teaching you wish to follow. There is one, and it's quite obscure, and it's definitely not mainstream, but I'm going to give it to you because it's kind of interesting. There was a thought that you would hang on a wall by the appendage by which you had sinned. So if you gossiped, you would be hanging by your tongue. And if you stole things, you would be hanging by your fingers. And you can imagine which part of your body you would be hanging from if you had committed a sexual crime or adultery or anything like that. But as I say, it's not a mainstream Jewish perspective, so don't write that in your exam. The idea of this Garden of Eden, this place where souls go and gather in this kind of paradise, came about because if you read the Torah, it says good people are rewarded and bad people are punished. And if you're good and you follow the commandments, good things will happen and you'll flourish in life and everything will be great. And anyone who is anyone would be able to tell you that that's not how the world works. Like, we look around the world and we know that it's not always the case that the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. And so there was a theological problem. We're told one thing, yet the reality of life doesn't bear that out. So the notion was that you would get your reward not on this earth, but in the next life, in the world to come. So you continue to be good, and even if your reward doesn't come now, it will come later and you'll enjoy that and experience it for all eternity. So whatever suffering you had now would be redressed later on. There is it's a tricky thing because Jews have really not spent a lot of time thinking about what happens afterwards and this idea of doing good in order to receive reward. Even though there's a lot of that in the Torah, it's really, Judaism is very much focused on the here and now, living the best life we can possibly live here on this earth, and not for reward, but because it's the right thing to do. But the reality is, we're human beings and we do look for that justice and that idea of doing good begets good in this world. There is also a suggestion that there will be a messianic time, either a Messiah will come or there'll be a messianic era where there will be peace on earth and everything will be paradise here on earth. So that Gan Eden, that Garden of Eden, will no longer be a paradise out in the ether. It will be a paradise here on earth. And there are some within the Jewish tradition who suggest that when that happens, there will be either a return of souls. So all the souls that are hanging out in the other Garden of Eden will come to earth and hang out with all the souls on earth. And it will be an eternal paradise, and there'll be no more war, no more suffering, no more death. It's just everyone living together in peace and harmony. Some within that idea think that there will be bodily resurrection. So for many, the idea is that the souls will return, but individual human beings will not be lifted from their grave and be housed again in their body. And I was once teaching a class in the nursing home, and someone said to me, you know, Rabbi, I've been very worried because I'm now 95. And if I'm resurrected, which body will I be resurrected in? Will it be my 95-year-old body or my 25-year-old body? Because I'd really prefer the 25-year-old one if I could. And so I think there are a lot of things about bodily resurrection that are not worked out, but there is definitely that notion within Judaism. There is also the suggestion that at that time, everyone will be resurrected and they'll make their way to the Mount of Olives, which is in Jerusalem. And there everyone will be judged. Like there'll be an atonement, a moment of you've been a good human, you are not a good human. And then we will, after that moment, we'll all go on to be given eternal life on earth. And so many Jewish people will choose to be buried in the Mount of Olives. It's considered a real honor to be buried there. And also that way they'll be very close to where they need to be, rather than having to travel all the way from Australia in your new body, in your soul, in order to be judged on the Mount of Olives. So you can see that what happens when someone dies is not so straightforward in Judaism to answer that question. There is a spectrum of belief and opinion, but almost everyone, I would say, would suggest that there is a body and there is a soul. And when we die, the soul separates from the body, and what happens to the soul is a matter of debate and discussion. So then what happens to the body? What do we do in terms of burial and mourning customs in Judaism? So first of all, I want to talk about burial versus cremation. You remember we talked at the beginning about the Torah saying that we are gathered to our ancestors. And in the Torah, we say, it says that the first human being is created from the dust of the earth. So Adam, which Adam is the first human being, is created from Adamah, which is the word for earth, or from the dust, or from the ground. So Adam, Adamah, earth. So the concept is that when we were created from the earth, and when we die, we should return to the earth, and our whole body should return and be absorbed back into the earth. And like we said, gathered to our ancestors, and people were buried on the land where their families lived and worked. So that also is a very sort of a very deep notion and understanding of connection with land and our bodies. Cremation is traditionally seen as a non-Jewish choice. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is connected to this idea of bodily resurrection. There is a teaching that we will be resurrected from a particular bone in the base of our neck, top of our spine, and if we've cremated somebody, that bone disintegrates, and therefore there's no place from which to resurrect a body. The other tradition, which I think is probably more prevalent and more understood, is that the body housed our soul. The body is like a sacred vessel, and we have to do everything we can to respect and honor and preserve it. And cremation was seen as something that kind of desecrated, that might be too strong a word, but desecrated the body, and therefore was not seen as a Jewish choice and not seen as a way to honor the people who have died. Many Jews today choose to be cremated, and they choose for many, many reasons. Some because they have a fear of dying, others because they don't want family to have a grave or a place that they associate with them that is not their physical self. Others do it for environmental reasons, for land use reasons. There are millions and millions of reasons that people choose cremation. So Orthodox rabbis will never participate in a cremation. They will not officiate at a service for someone who is being cremated. Reform rabbis, or sometimes you'll hear them referred to as progressive rabbis, will officiate at cremations for Jewish people. And I do officiate at cremations for Jewish people. I believe that people have the right to choose what kind of method they want for their body to be released, and for some that's cremation. And interestingly, there's an argument in the Jewish community that after the Holocaust, where many Jews were cremated against their will, that we should not be officiating or doing cremation services. But many of the people who I officiate at cremation services for are survivors of the Holocaust, where many of their relatives concluded their lives in the gas chambers. So they, even though that was their, or maybe sometimes because that was their family's end, they choose the same thing for themselves. So it's not a traditional Jewish choice. There are some Jews who choose that today, and there are some rabbis who will officiate at a cremation service. Right. Just checking what's next. Right. Preparing the body. So once a person dies, the body is taken to the funeral home. The Jewish funeral home is called the Hevra Kadisha, which means the holy gathering of people. So the people who care for bodies and prepare them for funerals is considered one of the most holy and sacred jobs that anyone can do, is to take care of a person's body after they have died. And the tradition says that the soul remains close to the body until the burial, and then it starts its journey on to whatever comes next. So we want to honor that body that has housed that soul for all of those years, or however many years it happens to be. So we wash and prepare the body, not like in a shower, it's a ritual washing. And so there's a specific system by which that happens, and a group of people volunteer their time to do that for all of the Jewish community's burials. The Hevra Kadisha, the Jewish funeral home, will not prepare bodies or officiate at services if a person is being cremated. So we have a funeral home that is a non-Jewish funeral home that we work with, who helps us to honor those Jewish customs and those practices, even though sorry, I'm just going to, even though they are not Jewish, and that's not part of their tradition, but they help us to honor people, even in a cremation service, in a Jewish way. So the body is ritually washed, prayers are recited, and then the body is dressed in shrouds. So everybody is dressed in the same clothing. They're cotton, very simple garments. And the idea is that not only does the body get gathered to the earth and will slowly be absorbed into the earth as it slowly decomposes, that every part of that body will decompose, including the clothes. So there's no belt buckles, there's no metal, there's no anything that would not be absorbed back into the earth. And every single person has exactly the same clothing. It doesn't matter who you are, if you're a king, if you're a pauper, everybody is dressed in exactly the same clothes, because there's a very, very strong principle in Judaism that we are all equal in death, that we come into the world with nothing and we leave with nothing. And so the preparations, the funeral service, everything connected with Jewish burial and Jewish funerals is identical, except for the eulogy, which we'll talk about in a moment. But every other part of the Jewish funeral service is the same for everybody, which I think is really important. The talit, the prayer shawl, is sometimes buried with the person who has died. Their prayer shawl will be buried with them, and the fringes on the corners of the prayer shawl represent the commandments. And now that that person has died, that body will no longer be able to fulfill the commandments, and so the corner is cut to symbolize that moment. But the talit as well will be absorbed back into the earth and become part of the earth over time. Many people don't choose to be buried with their talit, because the talit they then pass on to other family members or other people who may wish to wear it. And it's a beautiful legacy and tradition for the family. But traditionally, you would be buried, a man would be buried with his talit. A body is never left alone from the time that they die until the time of the burial. So we have someone called a shomer, which means a guard. So someone sits with the bodies and often will recite psalms or read, have soothing things happening in that space, so that the bodies and the soul, because remember, the soul is hovering with the body. So it's something to kind of soothe the soul's journey on, and to protect and care for the body between the time of death and the time of burial. We also light a candle when somebody dies next to their bed, next to their head. And that candle, the flame of the candle, symbolizes the soul, and it's a physical reminder of the loss of that person and of their continued presence through their soul. The Jewish coffin is a plain pine box. Just like everyone is dressed the same, everyone has the same coffin. There are stories that Jews were competing with each other and trying to see who would have the fanciest coffin, and the amount of money that you spent sort of demonstrated how wealthy you were, or how much you, supposedly how much you loved the person, because you were willing to spend a huge amount of money. And a man called Rabbi Gershom came along and he said, that's it. We are all equal in death. We are all going to have exactly the same funeral service, the same coffin, the same simple plain clothes that we'll wear for burial. And the ideal way of Jewish burial is with a shroud, just to be wrapped in cloth and returned to the earth. But governments and health departments have made rulings that say that we need to have a coffin. So the Jewish coffin is the most simple form you can possibly have, and it decomposes and completely absorbs back into the earth. So even so far as the nails in the coffin are not metal, they're made of wood, so that they can also become part of the earth. A congregant approached me recently about environmental burials, and apparently they have cardboard coffins for people to be buried in. And I think if that ever becomes something which governments and things and health departments and the say is okay, then I think that very much could be a way that Jewish people could choose to go as well. The timing of the funeral. So Jewish funerals take place as soon as possible after the death. There is I guess it's a bit of a myth that says that it has to happen in 24 hours after the person dies. That very rarely happens in my experience, but as soon as possible. Now, if you think about it, it probably was a very practical ruling. The Jewish people, the Israelites, were a desert people, and to leave a body out in the heat and in the sun, it was probably not a great thing to do. So you would really, for practical reasons, want to bury someone as soon as possible. But I think for psychological reasons as well, it's a very significant and important thing to do. The time between somebody dying and their burial can be a really difficult time, and you're kind of in a bit of a limbo. So I think for to kind of begin that mourning practice and to be able to sort of go on that journey, the sooner the burial can happen, the better. And as I said, everyone has the same service. They have the same clothes, the same coffin, the same prayers, the same structure of the service. So it's really, there are very few decisions to make. There is a Jewish cemetery, so you would be buried there. And so there are very few choices to make. And it's all a very simple process in that sense. Sometimes funerals will be delayed, so family can travel from overseas or whatever it is to be there. But as soon as possible after the death, the funeral happens. So let's talk a bit about the service, the funeral service. As I said, it's very simple. It begins with a few psalms and readings from the tradition that talk about the fragility of life, the meaning of life and death, and the purpose of who we are. And they are recited in Hebrew or chanted with a traditional chant. There is no choral music, there's no instruments. At a time of mourning, live music in that way is not considered part of the mourning process. So again, it's a very simple, basic kind of service. A rabbi is not required to conduct a funeral service. Anybody can do that. We try not to tell people that because, we want to keep officiating at funerals, but anybody can officiate at a funeral for somebody else. The central part of the funeral, in my perspective, is the eulogy, the time when we get to speak about the person who has died. And one of the teachings, one of the important things, it says specifically that a eulogy must be given for the person who has died. So it's really important that there is that moment where we celebrate and acknowledge and remember the person whose funeral it is. The rabbis say that everyone who's there needs to be able to recognize the person you're talking about. So if the person, you can't make them into a saint when they weren't, and you shouldn't, only point out all their terrible, horrible qualities, but you need to give a realistic remembering of that person and their life and who they were, what was important to them, and to really celebrate that moment. It's considered a huge honor to be able to do that for your own family members. If it's too hard, then people don't, very often it's a very difficult thing for family members and for people to do. So most often the rabbi or the person conducting the service will deliver the eulogy, but it can be anybody at all who is there. So if the funeral is a cremation service, this is where it ends, and there are two prayers that are recited. The first one, El Malei Rachamim, which asks that the person's soul be at rest and at peace, and then a prayer called the Mourner's Kaddish. I'm going to talk about the Kaddish prayer a little bit later, so keep that in your mind. If it's a burial, then we make our way to the cemetery, or if the service is conducted at the graveside, then we continue with the next part of the service. We take a moment to seek forgiveness from the person who has died for anything that we may have done that hurt them, and we offer them forgiveness for anything they may have done that hurt us. And it's not out loud. We just take a moment of silence for us to make that connection with the person who's died and really resolve anything, so that it's a sense of saying goodbye to them from a place of peace. And then we lower the coffin into the ground. Then everyone who is present is invited to place 3 shovelfuls of earth onto the grave. It is considered one of the greatest acts of goodness and compassion and love that we can do, to participate physically in a person's burial. It is something we do purely for the love of them, and not because we are expecting any kind of reward or recompense for doing it. We do it purely because we love them, and they can never repay us. They can never thank us because they're no longer part of this earth, but we can care for them and look after them in those last moments of their life. Then, once the grave has been filled, we recite again the El Malei Rachamim prayer, the prayer asking that they be at rest and at peace, and then the mourners recite the Kaddish prayer. Now, who are the mourners in Judaism? In Judaism, there are categories of people who are considered to be mourners. They are, if your spouse, your child, your sibling, or your parents die, you are considered a mourner. There are a lot of people at a funeral in mourning, but the mourners are those 4 people. No, those categories of people. The mourners, before the service begins, are given the opportunity to do something called kriya, which is the tearing of a piece of clothing. And that tearing is symbolic of the feeling that your heart is torn at the time of the loss of the person that you loved. There is something very visceral and very powerful about the sound of that cloth tearing. And often if people have not cried, or, if people are feeling that they're holding things in, that's often the moment that the emotion is able to be kind of let out. There's something really powerful about that ritual. So after the service, the mourners return home, and there is a tradition to eat simple, round food. So lentils, eggs, because they represent the cycle of life and something which we're thinking about at this time. Oh, sorry, there's one more thing. The service at the cemetery finishes, and then the people who are at the cemetery, at the grave, make 2 rows, and the mourners walk between these 2 rows of family and friends. And the last line of the funeral service is, "Now go forth to life." So there's a recognition that once the person has died, you've taken care and love and respect and honor by burying them according to the tradition. Then it's time for you to return to the world, and it's a world completely changed now because of the loss of that person that you loved. And so your friends and people who are there at the service make 2 rows, and you walk between them and feel their love and their support and their comfort. By doing that and by standing in that way, they're saying, we're there for you, and we're supporting you, and we're helping you, and we're guiding you now as you return to this life, which looks different and feels different as a result of the death of the person that you loved. So once we have gone home from the service, we begin what there are 3 mourning periods in Judaism. So the first period is 7 days after the funeral. The next period is 30 days, 1 month. And then the next period is 11 months / 1 year. So we'll start with the 7 days. So after somebody has died, for the first 7 days, there's a period known as Shiva, which in Hebrew means 7. So 7 days, the family, the mourners stay home, and they sit on low stools or low chairs. They don't wear leather, which was considered a luxury. Many people will cover their mirrors, because mirrors are a sign of vanity and something that we look at to worry about how we're looking and how we're appearing. And they say, at this time of mourning, we shouldn't be worried about any of those things. All we should worry about is grieving and feeling the loss and remembering the person who's died. We also spend the day really at home, and the tradition is that people come and visit you and sit with you in your loss and in your sorrow. And much of this comes from the book of Job, where he has friends. He suffers an immeasurable loss, and his friends come and they sit with him. And sometimes the most powerful sitting can be in silence. You can be there with the person, or you can offer words of comfort, or you can spend time remembering and talking about the person who's died. So that first 7 days is a very intense period of mourning. You don't go to work, you don't go to parties, you don't, like, all the things that you probably don't feel like doing. And it's really interesting that psychology has come up with many different ideas about the process of mourning and the stages of grief and mourning. And Jewish custom and tradition reflects exactly what psychology says we should do. So there's a lot of wisdom in these ancient traditions and these ancient ways of doing things. So the first 7 days, the first week, is a really intense time of mourning. And during that time, I'll actually come to that afterwards. So, no, I'll say now. So, I mentioned the Kaddish prayer before. It's traditional to recite that prayer every day for the person who has died for that 7 days. Now, that prayer cannot be recited without a minimum number of Jews present. It's called a minyan, which means it's like a quorum. In Orthodox Jewish circles, that's 10 adult men, and in Reform and Progressive Jewish circles, it's 10 adult Jews. And they gather together because nobody should be saying this Kaddish prayer. You say the mourner's Kaddish when you're in mourning, and there's a thought that no one should be alone. Everyone should have their community with them at this time of mourning. So given that that prayer can only be said with 10 Jewish people there, normally you would go to the synagogue, but because you're in mourning, you shouldn't have the burden of having to leave your home and get to the synagogue. So basically the synagogue comes to you. So for those first 7 days, except for Shabbat, except for the Sabbath, groups of people gather in the home of the mourner, and together they will be present with them to do the service, to be able to say that Kaddish prayer. As an aside, most people in my congregation will do one night of those prayers, but traditionally it's 7 nights of that very intense prayer and mourning service. Then after the 7 days, the people rise up from their mourning stools. So they're sitting on low stools, and they'll get up and symbolically walk around the block to show that they have finished their period of mourning and they're ready now to return back to the world in a subdued way, but back into the world and into their lives. And that was incredibly powerful when people lived very in close communities together, and you would see the family walking, and you would know that the time had come for them to get up from their time of mourning. Then the next time period is 30 days. It includes those 7 days. So 30 days from the time of the funeral. And this time the restrictions are lifted a little bit, but not completely. So you return to work, you return to life, but you try not to go to big celebrations, listen to live music, go on holidays, trips. You just kind of slowly and gently return to life and return to the world. And at the end of that 30-day period, and you continue to say Kaddish, you continue to say that morning prayer, but you would do it at the synagogue rather than in your home. And at the end of that 30 days, that's the end of the mourning period for everyone, except if you're mourning your parents. There's a separate and special form of mourning for the loss of your parents, because all of us will only ever have 2 parents, although in our world that is a little bit more complicated. Lots of people have more than 2 parents, but generally 2 parents have brought you into this world and have given you life, and to honor them and thank them for that, there is a longer period of mourning. And to acknowledge the special relationship that people have with their parents, the time of mourning is much longer. So it's a 12-month period, a shana, a year. Now, I said earlier that I would come back to this idea of souls making their way up to the, repenting for the wrongdoing and then making the journey to the next life. And the mourner's Kaddish, this particular prayer, is connected to that idea. So there is a teaching that says that if people on earth are saying Kaddish, are saying that prayer for the person who's died, it will help their elevation up to the Garden of Eden, to the place where the souls are going to next. It will happen quicker and more easily if people say Kaddish for you here on earth. And part of that is this idea that if people cared about you so much that they're prepared to say Kaddish for you, then you must have been a good person, and it counts as a positive thing towards your scales of good and bad deeds. It will add some good to the scales. So there is this idea that you would say Kaddish for that whole year, just so that you give your parents the best chance you can for them to make a quick journey up to the next place. Now, remember I said the worst, most horrible human being would spend 12 months in this place of repenting. And nobody wants to imply that their parents were someone who might have needed the 12 months of that prayer and would be spending 12 months before the soul began their journey. So you don't want to imply that, but you also want to give your parents the absolute best shot at the next world as soon as possible. So you want to give them as much help as you can without implying that they need the 12 months of the prayer. So the tradition is to say it for 11 months. So you say for the death of a parent, you will say that prayer for 11 months, which helps their soul elevate and move into the next world and the next realm. But the period is 12 months of mourning. When you come home from the funeral, you also light a candle called a Shiva candle, which is a candle that burns for 7 days. And that's that 7 days of mourning. And like I said, that candle and the flame represents the soul of the person that you're remembering. And it's a physical reminder of their presence being really there with you and surrounding you and part of the world for you at that time. On the anniversary of a person's death, it's called a yahrzeit. So every year on the anniversary of that person's death, their name is read in the synagogue and prayers are recited. The Kaddish prayer is recited for them as we remember them and we honor them. This prayer, the mourner's Kaddish, you would think it would be all about mourning, about loss, about grieving. It's actually not about any of those things. The mourner's Kaddish is a prayer which is a praise of God. So part of the psychology was that I think a time when you're least likely to want to praise God, God has taken this person that you loved from the earth and from your world at the time of greatest loss and perhaps anger and perhaps mourning, that God, you might feel anger towards God and you're kind of forced to praise God. So we frame it as praising God and thanking God for the gift and the blessing of that person's life. And so most Jewish people have no idea what that prayer actually translates as. And there is a rhythm to the words. It's interesting because it's actually not in Hebrew. That prayer is in Aramaic, which is the language that Jews spoke. So it was considered to be very important that they understood what they were saying. But the irony is that today, very few people understand Aramaic and very few people understand the words of the prayer. But they do know the words and they do know the rhythm of the words. And there is something incredibly powerful about that beyond its meaning. I think this is one of those prayers that has gone beyond the literal meaning of the prayer to be all about what the prayer itself means to the people as opposed to the literal translation of the prayer. So when people hear the words, they recognize them and they associate them very deeply and strongly with that time of mourning and of remembering and of honoring the people that have come before them in this world. So I think at the end of the things I was going to talk about. I'm really happy to take questions, but I see there are not really very many people here. So I am not sure if I wrap up now or if there are any questions that anyone might have. One more time, the notes will be available for you, and also I direct you to the Emanuel Synagogue website. The Emanuel Synagogue website and www.emmanuel.org.au. Okay, so I've been asked if there are some top tips for understanding death and mourning. Here are, I think, the basic principles, which is, I think, what you might mean, to consider and to remember with Judaism and death and mourning. So first of all, the idea that the soul and the body are separate, that we care for. Lots of our mourning practices are about caring for the body until it is returned to the earth, and then we sort of free the soul, and we focus then and shift to the mourners rather than the person who has died. That's tip one. Tip number two is that all Jewish people are equal in death. So no matter whether you are the king or the poorest of poor, everyone has exactly the same funeral, the same preparations, the same customs. So if you look at lots of the Jewish customs, they're all about making sure that it is simple and the same for everybody. Then there is also a very, I guess there's a balance between the two groups that we consider at the time of funerals. It's first of all caring for the person who's died and their body and honoring and respecting it. And then there's also looking after and providing a structure for the mourners to work their way through this time and process of grieving. And I think Jewish people are very comforted by the fact that there are really no decisions to be made. Everything has been done for you, and you just kind of have to go along with the process and follow the steps. And you don't have to make decisions. You don't have to decide what music, what coffin, what clothes, what kind of service, where you should have it, what stuff. Like everything is the same for everybody. So it's all taken care of, and you can just kind of surrender to your grief and your mourning and be able to be in the moment. And then after the service, I think there's those 3 periods of mourning, which also really importantly acknowledges that you don't just get over someone's death straight away, that there is a process for grieving, there's a process of mourning, and there is a structure by which Judaism helps you to guide you through that process. And I think in our world, we are very quick to kind of ask people to get over it and to move on. And Judaism gives people permission to spend time in their loss and in their grief in whatever way that needs to be. And the fact that it's kind of for a year for everybody. We put up the headstone on a grave, traditionally 1 year after the person has died, to kind of mark the end of that year. And there's an acknowledgement that that first year is very, very difficult. For every single person, it's really, really hard to have the first birthday without the person that you love. And the first, for us, Passover Seder or celebration in the family, whatever it is that you are commemorating or celebrating throughout the year, and you notice that they're not there, that first year is really difficult and tricky. So the community supports you and helps to kind of hold you through that grief. I hope that answered the question. If someone is cremated, what happens to the ashes? There are a number of different options for ashes. Here in Sydney, there is a niche wall. So there is a wall at a couple of different cemeteries just for Jewish ashes, which is interesting given that cremation is not a traditional Jewish choice, but there is an acknowledgement that many Jewish people do choose that and would like to have their ashes placed with other Jewish people as they would be in a cemetery if they were buried. So sometimes there is the ashes are placed in a wall. Sometimes there is a section, a rose garden in one of the cemeteries here that is just for Jewish ashes. So sometimes they're buried in the rose garden. And I have created a ceremony that combines the stone setting, like when we unveil the stone on the grave. And remember, I said that happens a year on. There's a ceremony for that. And there's also the burial ceremony. So I've created a ceremony that combines those two things, where we can bury the ashes in the ground and then mirror the process of burying the body. And other people will choose to scatter them, but there's no ritual for that, and I'm never part of that ceremony. How important is the community in death and mourning? The community is vital to the process of death and mourning in Judaism, so much so that, remember, that prayer, the Kaddish prayer, cannot be recited without 10 people from the community being there with you. And the idea is 10 people is the minimum number you need to consider that you have a community around you. So you'll notice many of the rituals around the funeral and around the burial and even the preparation of the body, that does not happen with the family. It's the community who step in to cushion and to support and care for the family through all of those processes. And during the Shiva, during those 7 days of mourning, when the family is at home and what's called sitting Shiva, so they're in their house, community members will bring them food and will make sure that they're being visited often and take care of all of their needs, so that all they need to worry about is being sad and grieving and mourning and being in their loss. Like, they don't have to think about any other way of taking care of themselves because the community is taking care of them. So thank you for those questions. They've been really important. Are there any others? All right, then I hope I have covered everything. Please be in touch with me if there's anything I can do to help or assist after you've looked at that mourning ritual book. And I am at jninio@emanuel.org.au, and I will do my best to answer any questions you may have and to help and support you in any way I can. I wish you good luck for your exam and for this process, and thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more about Judaism and our practices around death and mourning.